Hi, everyone. Welcome to the chapter, I guess this is April, isn't it? The April chapter meeting of Climate Reality Project, the New York City Metro chapter. And I'm gonna just make a few announcements before we get started with the meeting in just a few minutes. And for those of you who are new to to the first time to the New York City chapter meeting, just wanted to let you know a little bit about the chapter. So we're actually the first Climate Reality Project chapter that was created. We have about 1,000 members across the all boroughs and most zip codes here in the city. Our vision is a socially just, environmentally responsible, and innovative green New York City. And our education is twofold: is both to educate and to mobilize New Yorkers to take urgent climate action across every level of society. So we do that through a three-pronged strategy. And the first is to connect people by bringing members together in this diverse community, pursuing solutions to the climate crisis. And we do this as almost like a platform. So we try to introduce members to as many different types of groups and ways to express their climate activism, and let them choose and go with those. And that platform means that maybe sometimes they stay with us, maybe sometimes they find their passion elsewhere, but they're still fighting the fight. So that's our first goal, is to connect people. The second goal is to inspire, and we try to do that with for instance, events like this, where we'll be seeing tonight two outstanding speakers representing really the future of how we need to go to fight climate change in the US. And then finally is to act. And what's really important here is that we provide opportunities for members to take action. And what's interesting about our chapter is that we have very many different ways to do that, whether it's through our advocacy group, who is fighting and lobbying at the federal and state level, or it's through our environmental justice group, through our food group, or our corporate activation team. So that's a little bit about our chapter. And if that is in any way intriguing to you, please connect with us. Here's our social media and our website accounts, and a tab to join. And Deepa's going to be dropping those into the chat so that you can access those. And then I have two quick updates before we move on to the presentation. The first one is about the Renewable Heat Now campaign, which is a goal, or the goal of this campaign is to pass legislation to decarbonize New York's building sector. It's the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in New York. The good news is that the geothermal tax credit was one of the big pieces we wanted. It was passed through the budget. The not so good news is that the other three pieces of legislation that we're looking for, the All Electric Buildings Act and the Gas Transition Act and the Advanced Codes, need to pass through the regular session. So we're meeting and we're lobbying with legislators actively. We have 3 meetings tomorrow, which is a little bit hairy for us, but typically we meet 5 to 10 legislators per week and trying to get co-sponsorships. So we're looking for members who want to join us, primarily as constituents. You can just join as a constituent and show up in these meetings, try to get the meeting and then show up in these meetings. So if you're interested in that, please contact us at the chapter email. And specifically, we have 2 meetings on Thursday with Charles Fall and Dan Court. If you're a constituent of theirs, please also maybe just drop something in the chat so that we can contact you and invite you to those meetings. And then the last update we have tonight is about the CLCPA. And for those of you who are familiar with this is the Climate Act in New York. And it really is it's a groundbreaking law. It's one of the strongest climate legislation that exists. But it's a framework, and it requires a Climate Action Council to issue a set of laws to facilitate and to make sure that we meet the goals of the Climate Act, the CLCPA. But the fossil fuel industry is putting a lot of money and resources into an astroturfing campaign of disinformation, and we need to show public support at the public hearings. So again, I think Deepa will put these 2 links in the chat. We really encourage everyone to reach out and to make your comments either in written form or in public form at the public hearings. And I saw Anshul come in, he's doing this, and Deepa's doing this, a bunch of us are doing this, and it's not scary at all. It's something that's actually quite fun. So again, if you need help with that, let us know and we'll help you. But it's really important, if you see any letter writing apps or anything like that, really take the time to fill those out, because without that, we really don't have a chance of meeting the goals of the CLCPA, and it's just a hollow law. Okay, so those were the updates that we had for tonight. And I'm really excited to move on to the bulk of the show. And I hope most of the members have been able to join already. I do want to just make one housekeeping note. If you'd like to have live transcription, please, you can turn that on. We have that set up now, so you're more than welcome to get transcription if you're having difficulty understanding or any of us. So the topic of tonight's meeting is Heed the Cry, Electrify. And what we hope to achieve in this meeting is to really excite everyone about the opportunity of electrification as a solution to the decarbonization of our world, and a huge part of the solution of the climate crisis. And for that part of the agenda, we will have Ari Matusiak, who is the CEO of Rewiring America. And the second part, we'll talk about more of the practical solutions of how to, translate that theory into reality, and talk a little bit about what it really looks like. And so for that, Glenn Schatz of BlocPower, who's the Chief Revenue Officer of BlocPower, will be presenting. And then we'll have a good portion of time, about half an hour, for questions at the end. So I would encourage everyone to put your questions in the chat box. Deepa will be looking at those, and she'll be moderating a Q&A session at the end. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Ari Matusiak. Goes by the nickname Breaker Box. Maybe it would be great to understand where that comes from, but he's currently the CEO of Rewiring. That's the first question for the chat box, but he's the CEO of the Rewiring America, and has a really strong background. He's a co-founder and managing partner of Purpose Venture Group. He served in the Obama White House as a special assistant to the president. He was chief strategy officer at Renovate America, and is co-founder of Young Invincibles. He graduated from some great schools and lives in Southern California. And another interesting fact is that he's the majority owner of the Green Bay Packers. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to introduce Ari.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you, Paul. Just a quick point of clarification. My family has 2 shares of the nonprofit Green Bay Packers football organization. So it gives us a chance to say that we are part owners of an NFL franchise, and it has absolutely no economic value. But the shares are hung on a wall in the basement of my parents' house in Wisconsin. Wonderful being here with all of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen. Can I be enabled to share my screen?
Oh, you want to go ahead and make them our co-host?
Okay, there we go. Here we go. I got it. Can you all see this okay? It's coming through. Okay. Is it big enough for everybody, or is it good size? Okay. Well, wonderful. So again, wonderful being here. I'm Ari Matusiak, CEO of Rewiring America. I'll talk a little bit about our argument for why electrifying everything is the right and best approach for addressing the climate crisis. So we were founded in the summer of 2020 with a simple idea that electrifying everything is the best solution for tackling the climate crisis at the scale that we need to, and on the timetable that we need to. And our why is really about economic renewal and bringing climate infrastructure home. And really, if you kind of take a step back and you think about the way in which we have internalized and talked about climate as a community of advocates, but just frankly, more importantly, as a broader community, it has often been positioned in a couple of different ways. One way that it's been positioned is that we need to have a series of breakthrough technologies that are going to save us from ourselves. Nuclear fusion is an example of that, or direct air capture technology is an example of that. Or it gets framed as really a story of adaptation and privation. We're going to have to change our behaviors pretty fundamentally in order to live in the world as it warms and in order to stave off warming. But it's in either case, it is those narratives are not very inviting or inclusive. And the one, most of us are really not going to be involved in that because most of us are not nuclear physicists or are folks in the lab inventing brand new technologies. And then the other, it doesn't really sound like a lot of fun. And so when you start to think about the 70% of Americans, when you take a poll who care about climate and are concerned about climate, there hasn't been a real way for them to see themselves in the solution. In fact, it feels a lot more like it's a solution that is being dictated by others besides them, and that they don't have a lot of agency around. For us, we view the strategy as really about centering everyone in that solution, because in fact, the solution sits inside of the machines that we use in our day-to-day lives, in the places where we live, work, learn, play, and pray. Why is that? When you look at emissions, it turns out that about 90% of our emissions come from energy generation and consumption. Yes, there are other sources of emissions in terms of from agriculture and refrigerants and soil management and whatnot. But the vast, vast majority of our emissions come from the energy that we generate and then consume in our day-to-day lives. When you map that 90% of energy emissions down and to all of the different sort of places where it goes, and I'll talk about that more in a second, it turns out that 42% of our energy-related emissions actually come from decisions we make around our kitchen tables. What kind of cars we drive or how we get to and from where we go, how we heat our homes and water, how we cook our food, how we dry our clothes, and where our electricity comes to make all of that stuff happen. 42% of the 87%. If you extend that out beyond beyond our households and beyond the kitchen table decisions that we make to where we work, where we learn, where we play, and where we pray, that number goes up to more like 70% or so. Long story short, it's a huge amount that sits within our purview, and that is sort of our collective purview, and that is defined by decisions that we are making, choice points that we make, sometimes unconsciously, day in and day out. Why is that? Well, let's do a little bit of a history lesson. So if you go back to the first energy crisis in the 70s, some of you may have seen or are familiar with this diagram. It's called the Sankey diagram. It is produced by the US government, and it is designed to map the supply of energy and how much we have and where it goes, how it is used. This Sankey diagram did not exist before the energy crisis in the 70s, before people were snaking around the corner to waiting in line for gasoline at the gas station. The US government did not have a diagram like this. And over the last 50 years, it has reliably reproduced that diagram. And it hasn't changed all that much. There are more sources of energy on the left because we're now more meaningfully using solar and hydropower and wind and geothermal. But really, the basic orientation of it is the same. And the whole point of it is to ensure that we have enough energy to go around to supply our needs and to power our economy. And the upshot that we get from that whole exercise is that waste is bad and that efficiency is good, meaning we will have enough supply as long as we use the supply that we have as efficiently as we can. And that is why we've had policy fall from that sort of construct over the last 50 years that looks like things that you all know quite a lot about. Energy Star efficiency standards for our appliances, CAFE standards for our cars. How do we make machines that give us the performance and the comfort and the qualities that we want using the least amount of energy possible? That is an energy efficiency framework. But the climate crisis is not the same kind of crisis as an energy crisis because, of course, you can't efficiency your way to zero. You will never cut down to zero as long as you're using machines that are powered by fossil fuels. So in the main, what needs to happen is we need to swap out the entirety of our machine set from being a fossil fuel powered one to being an electrified one. In 2018, my fellow co-founder of Rewiring America, Dr. Saul Griffith, got a grant from the US Department of Energy to map the energy flows down in the US economy to 0.1% granularity. So the US government has the Sankey diagram kind of as cartooned, the cartoon version of which I showed you a couple slides ago. And then this is Saul's version, which maps it down to 0.1% granularity, as I said. And the whole point of it is to sort of break down these sort of artificial categories that, that we have been using to understand emissions and energy flows. And what happens when you break it down at this level of granularity is that you discover that things that are assigned to sectors like industry are actually activities that you all are engaging in your day-to-day lives. What do I mean by that? 4% of the energy that we use in this economy is pulling gas out of the ground, putting it in a pipeline and pumping it to your house when you turn your thermostat to make your home warmer at night. That 4% is actually ascribed in that Sankey diagram I showed a couple slides ago to industrial activity in the economy, but is only happening because people are using gas-powered furnaces to heat their homes and are dialing up that energy in order to do that. And so that 42% number I shared with you about the decisions that we make around our kitchen tables is based in this analysis that is illustrated in the slide that I'm showing right now. And once you kind of break down to that level of granularity, you can start to think about where the answer lies, and it lies in the machines that we use in our day-to-day lives. And you can really, frankly, start to think much more kind of granularly and mathematically about it all. And it turns out that, you know, we can think about it from a supply and demand perspective. There are a lot of machines, but more like 1 million machines on the supply side that are very, very big. Think like oil rigs and pipelines and refineries that last a really long time. They're giant infrastructure projects, and they are a big part of our emissions profile. But there are also a much larger number of small machines that also last for a long time that we use in our day-to-day lives, about 1 billion of them across our 121 million households in the United States. And historically, the climate conversation has been driven by the supply side. You know, what are we going to do with the plants? How are we going to clean them up? All very important stuff. But we all live on the demand side. How are we going to get to and from work? How are we going to heat our homes and cook our food and dry our clothes? And so our focus is really there. And you can start to count the machines up. There are about 100 million space heaters in this country that are powered by fossil fuels, about 120 million water heaters, 220 million cars that we use in our day-to-day lives, about 100 million cooktops and grills and range tops, 20 million gas-powered dryers. And then there's a whole bunch of household infrastructure that's going to need to be installed and replaced if we're going to electrify all those things. We're going to need solar panels across a number of homes and household batteries and breaker boxes and vehicle chargers, the 1 billion machines that I mentioned. And if we're going to electrify all those machines and we're going to do it in time to sort of meet the climate crisis, we basically need to be electrifying 500,000 homes a month for the next 25 years. Well, we're probably doing about 500 a month right now. So we have a long way to go. And we need to effectively change the market dynamic so that the most affordable and convenient machine to buy is the efficient electric one at the time of purchase and replacement. It turns out, though, that if we do that, we're going to help a lot of people in a lot of different ways. If we electrified water or space heating in the United States, 105 million households out of 121 million households would save money on their energy bills today. Actually, that number is higher because that 105 million number was before the spike in energy costs in the wintertime, this at the end of this year, and before Putin invaded Ukraine. So now it's more like 115 million out of 121 million. We'll create tens of millions of jobs by doing this that can't be automated or offshored. And the fact of the matter is that unless we electrify all the things, we will not be able to stay inside of 2 degrees warming or 1.5 degrees warming. So these are kind of like examples of you like map each of the machines and electrifying them. If we do all of those things, if we electrify those billion machines, we have a shot at staying inside of 1.5 degrees of warming and certainly 2 degrees warming. But if we don't, we do not. So it turns out that electrification is the unifying climate solution. It sort of ties all the pieces together. And it's also true that the more things we electrify, the easier it becomes to electrify everything else. If you just sort of think about it in your own life, if you end up purchasing or have purchased an EV and have that in your home, now it makes more sense for you to start to electrify the other appliances that you use in your day-to-day life so that you can take advantage of the battery that you have sitting in your garage if you sort of live in that kind of household. If you have solar panels and you have storage, the same thing holds. And so the more, as we start to electrify things in people's homes, it becomes more obvious that the next decision they make will be an electric one as well. So just a couple of like closing thoughts, because I know I'm at time. The idea here ultimately is that electrification is itself the energy efficiency strategy for us as an economy. We use about 100 quads of energy as an American economy. You don't need to be a scientist to just sort of know that that means it's a lot of energy. 100 quads is powering the most powerful economy in the entire world. Well, if we electrify everything in the economy that we can electrify, we will triple electricity demand. But because electric machines are so much more efficient than fossil fuel machines, we will actually cut in half the amount of energy we use as an economy, from 100 quads to less than 50 quads. And if you just process that for a second, what that means is that the American economy will run much more efficiently and deliver much more value back to communities, because we will have to use less energy in order to power the things that we are doing in order to create value and be that #1 economy in the world. So Rewiring has done a bunch of work as an organization. I won't sort of bore you with all of the activity report, but we are really focused on building the electrification movement and really excited to partner with folks like you all. We have been really focused on shifting the national policy conversation to electrification. I will point out this beautiful illustration here, and I see one behind Paul, and saw 2 more in his run-up. Sarah Lazarevich, who's on the screen with her son, is the artist who did all of those. She also happens to be our head of comms and brand. And this is part of our approach, which is really to create content to help people understand that the electrification narrative is one that makes sense and that resonates. We have focused quite a lot with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and war there on electrification for peace, and starting to understand the convergence of climate and energy security policy. And that until and unless we get off of oil and gas, we will never actually be able to have energy independence. And by the way, doing that also is the mechanism by which we address our climate goals. So we've been very focused on policy. We've been very focused on pushing to get Build Back Better done and sort of positioning ourselves as an authority on electrification. You can see Danelle in the lower picture there, Glenn's colleague from BlocPower, who you'll hear from in a second. And we've been doing a bunch of work to start to organize communities of mayors, of CEOs, of members of Congress even, so that we can start to create that vehicle by which electrification can be the thing that everybody is doing. So I'll just stop here by saying one thing, which is that you all have a big role to play. Obviously, you are advocates and experts and sort of climate enthusiasts in addition to leaders. But folks don't really think about their own agency in this whole realm, and don't necessarily understand that they themselves have a big role to play in the sort of the climate future that we collectively need to achieve. And so on a policy basis, we need to make it easier for folks to actually do the things that matter the most in their own lives. We need to make these machines affordable for everybody, convenient for everybody, available to everybody. But we also need folks to sort of understand themselves that these are the kinds of actions that they can take. Because it's not, personally, it's not something that I even really thought about a few years ago. I didn't really understand how much of a role my water heater had in the whole thing, because I didn't really think about my water heater. I just more thought about the fact that I had a hot shower and was grateful for that. But there's an obvious interrelationship, and that is the opportunity that's before all of us. And so thank you for the time, and really looking forward to taking your questions and finding ways to work together.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ari, for that. That was just, an inspiring discussion. And I want to just highlight for everyone who wants to read more about that, there's a great book called Electrify, written by Saul Griffith, which I just love. And it takes just actually a few hours to read because you get so excited about it and then you can't put it down. So anyway, after that plug, I would now like to introduce Glenn Schatz, and he is the Chief Revenue Officer of BlocPower, which is a climate tech startup based in Brooklyn. BlocPower is, something I would love to understand from Glenn today is actually how the company works, because I know it's like a platform as well as a nuts and bolts kind of way of electrifying buildings. So we'd like to learn a little bit more about that. But BlocPower has created a lot of jobs for qualified low-income workers, energy savings for building owners, reduced carbon emissions and asthma rates, and provides great financial returns to investors. Actually, and BlocPower's CEO, Donnell Baird, is a member of the Climate Reality Project Board of Directors, by the way, and is in the New York City chapter as well. So in 2021, the BlocPower moved on to a new sphere and is doing this job in Ithaca, which is the first city that is planning to decarbonize 100% of the city's buildings. So this is the first project of its type in the United States. And he's a graduate of the Naval Academy in Georgetown, I think which you share in common with Ari. And before BlocPower, he served in the Navy as a submarine officer and a bunch of other cool stuff in the Department of Energy as well. He lives in my hometown, Baltimore, with his wife and 2 kids. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Ari. So I don't have a presentation, but I do have a lot to talk about, so I'll get to it. So thanks for framing what BlocPower is and what we do. We like to say we're a building electrification enablement platform. And that can mean a lot of different things, and in practice it does mean a lot of different things. In New York City, where we're based, we do soup to nuts, kind of everything to do with a building, from selling electrification projects all the way to construction and financing of those projects. In other markets like California, Massachusetts, we work with partners where we fill in the gaps where needed, doing things like workforce development and financing. And then in markets like DC, Atlanta, Milwaukee, places where we're starting to get a little bit of an inroad, we want to work with on-the-ground partners and again, fill in gaps where needed, because we do offer a pretty wide variety of different things. BlocPower was founded in 2014 by Donnell and Keith. I was lucky enough to be on the other side of the table at the time of the founding. I was actually at the Department of Energy managing the small commercial business portfolio there, and got a chance to meet Donnell then. It took me about 7 years to actually jump ship and join his team, but I'm glad I did about a year ago. So BlocPower looks at a number of different elements of building, but we have a strong interest in serving traditionally underserved communities first. And so with energy efficiency work in the past and with building electrification, a lot of the early wins were around large office buildings like the New York Times building, or some like the Morgan Stanley building in New York City. These really large flagship projects, which are great because they have a lot of attention. On a project basis, they actually do have a big impact. But about 95% of the commercial buildings in the US are under 50,000 square feet. And of the 129 million buildings in the US, about 120 million of those are residential buildings. So even if you're doing these one-off really great projects that can bring private capital and do good things, we want to actually focus on the hard things. And so one of the things that inspired me about Danal at the beginning was that he wanted to take on the hard projects, the small and medium-sized buildings and small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as serve communities that are traditionally left behind with these sorts of investments. So, over the last 8 years or so, BlocPower has greened about 1,400 buildings, mostly in New York City. We've started doing full electrification work a couple of years ago and are starting to do more of that work now. Have great partners like Rewiring and others that can help shout about the need to do it. And, Ari did a great job framing the problem as well as the potential solution. But when an idea seems so obvious and it's not being done, I like to look at the problems and like why it's not getting done. So, we all sit here on the call. Again, unless you have a political or financial reason to not push in this direction, like there's no good reason to not electrify buildings. Again, the problem is so obvious and the solution is so obvious. So why is it not getting done? And so what I want to do today is focus a little bit on that question, on the complexity behind some of these projects, on why we see some of these projects not getting done, and then maybe talk through some of the barriers and some of the solutions as well. And so a lot of you are in New York. Most of us don't do construction. If you live in New York City, your building systems are probably an afterthought to you. So, you just call your super if something's wrong and hopefully they take care of it. Or if they don't take care of it, you complain. And if that still doesn't work, then you move. But in reality, there's a lot of complexity that goes into buildings and a lot of different people that touch a building. And so I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so going into the nitty gritty of how a building electrification project gets done. So you all can figure out the best places for you to plug in, no pun intended, to enable electrification projects in your buildings, in your towns, amongst your friends. So when you look at a building electrification project, a lot of it starts at the beginning. So when do these projects get done? Well, most HVAC projects get done when something breaks. And so one of the things that Rewiring does a great job of doing is talking to cities and utilities and policymakers about the things that need to be done prior to a system breaking so that building owners are ready to take on electrification projects when they have emergencies. So when your hot water heater breaks, when your heater breaks, that when you call your HVAC person or your plumber, that they're not putting a bunch of barriers in the way. So things like electric panel upgrades, replacing old wiring, making sure that you have the systems in place to be able to electrify. So, but the other time that that electrification projects can get done is when buildings are renovated or when they're sold. So you really need to start well in advance of an electrification project if you're trying to sell it. And you need to have done the research and to understand what you're getting into well in advance of actually doing one of these projects. So great, a building owner or consumer has made the choice to electrify. Well, then what? Well, then they might call an HVAC technician. But chances are, if you dial at random, the HVAC technician that you call is probably going to try to sell you a replacement for what you already have. Whether it's you have a boiler and they want to upgrade you to maybe a more efficient heating oil, which we don't want, or a gas furnace and they want to upgrade you to a more efficient gas furnace, which we don't want. What we want them is to sell you heat pumps, right? But if they're in the business, which most of them have been in the business for a long time, chances are they're a mid-50s white male who's trying to retire in the next 10 years because their kids don't want to take over the business for them. And the last thing they want to do in a lot of cases is take on risk of systems they don't understand that may involve electrical components that they don't understand and involve building control systems they don't understand. And so again, you want to electrify your building, but the person you call, if you're picking up the yellow pages or Googling, might not know how to do that. So let's say they do know how to do that. You've gotten lucky. You found the right person that wants to do an electrification project. Well, then there's the permitting that comes with this, right? In a lot of cases, it's touching an electrical system, it's touching HVAC, it's touching plumbing. And depending on the municipality you live in, that can involve pulling a number of different permits. And so governments aren't quite ready to take on electrification projects because they haven't streamlined this process for what is relatively low risk from a construction standpoint evolution. They have all these barriers that are potentially in the way. You may need to get stamp drawings from a mechanical, electrical, and plumbing person, right? So that's additional cost. So there's these other barriers up front. And again, you've already decided to do the project, you've already made the phone calls, you're already ready to do it, and you're already behind the 8 ball because of these barriers. So you get your MEPs done, you get your permits filed. Ideally, you have a contractor who's coordinating something for this for you. But if you don't, you may be coordinating an electrician, a plumber, an HVAC person, and then of course, your drywall and painters and all the people to finish it up at the end. So, these are all things that, you don't think about when undertaking a construction project, but they all exist. And then if you're lucky, you live in a state like New York, where there's great incentives for these projects. But then those incentives require you to fill out paperwork, make sure that your contractor you're using is involved in those incentive programs. And so even if there's incentives out there that maybe be paying for half the cost of the project, trying to actually take advantage of those can sometimes be filled with a bunch of different roadblocks. And then if you're lucky enough to be able to pay for it yourself, great. Most people, because these are relatively large purchases, anywhere between maybe $15,000 to $30,000 for a standard kind of 1,500 square foot project. Maybe you don't have that money sitting in your bank and you want to finance it. Well, which lenders are out there doing it? Is there a green bank that can do it? Where's the lowest interest rate? Is there a lien on the property? Is there some other credit hit that you have? So, and then finally, when it's running, it's a new system. Who's doing O&M and who's doing maintenance? And so, we see all these barriers. And at BlocPower, we've tried to be the single point of contact that you come to if you want to do electrification, and we take care of all of that for you. We try to take all that complexity away. And so, if you call BlocPower, ideally there is a BlocPower. In New York, you call us, right? In other markets, there may not be someone that offers all of those services turnkey. And so, one of the things that we like to talk about is this complexity, so you can start to understand that, it may seem simple when you start, but really you want someone that's helping you shepherd the project to completion, and then also someone to call if something isn't performing as you expect. And so, with all that said, what are some other barriers that are out there? So there's the inertia that I mentioned of people that are just doing more of the same. One of the biggest challenges that we have, and one that we especially face in new markets, is a workforce that can take this on. As I mentioned, a lot of the existing workforce, they've been doing the same thing for a long time, but we see this as an opportunity for new people to get into the trades. There are very few jobs out there where after about a year of training or so, you can start without a college education at $100 an hour, and that goes up as you get more experience. And these are, it's not like we're flooded with people that are able to do these projects. We are constantly looking for contractors that can do this sort of work. And those jobs aren't going away, as Ari mentioned. Those are jobs that are going to persist. They'll be there. If you go to a trade school and learn how to do this HVAC work, you will literally have a job for the rest of your life if you want it. Chances are you'll probably start your own company, and you'll be able to retire early and hopefully pass those on to your kids over time. So workforce is a big one. Policy can be an issue even in states that have good policies like New York, because there's a complexity of how utilities work, how incentives work, how utilities make changes with the Public Utilities Commission. And so, and then also there's the principal agent problem of, if you're a building owner and you have tenants, who's paying for heating, who's paying for electricity. If it's an affordable housing situation, how do we do these projects without increasing the energy burden for the end user? So there's just a lot of things to consider. I'm not trying to scare anyone away. These are really important to do. But what I would encourage you all to do is don't try to figure it out yourself. These are problems that have been solved. They've been solved by folks like BlocPower, but there are other companies that also do this work. And anyone who's telling you that, oh, it's easy and straightforward, I think you want to start asking a little more questions. Ideally, the person that you're talking to is able to make it easy and straightforward for you by taking the complexity away. So what are some of the solutions? Well, one of them is minimizing the number of touch points building owners need to go through to get a project done. So working with someone like BlocPower, or working with a energy concierge, or a full service contractor who can help get you all the way through the process, including the incentives. For policymakers, if you are putting a program together, spend less money on program management and more on people and buildings. And so we see this a lot. There are a lot of middle layers of people that have good intentions that end up all adding overhead to projects, and less money goes into getting projects done. We would encourage less money to go from program administrators to companies like BlocPower, and more to the actual end users and the projects. So streamline incentives, make sure that those incentives are going directly to the folks that need them and to getting projects done. Where possible, stack incentives. So if there's weatherization or efficiency incentives, make sure that those are bringing electrification incentives, and vice versa. If there are workforce incentive dollars, make sure that those programs are going toward things that can get building electrification done. As Paul mentioned, we are doing a program right now in New York City with about 1,000 people from Brownsville, Mott Haven, and South Jamaica. And we are putting them on energy efficiency and solar and EV charging stations, and broadband and building electrification. So try to align some of these workforce programs with other policy goals like building electrification. And finally, you all are consumers. Make sure that you're making your voice heard. As Ari said at the end of his presentation, you have to keep telling your contractors this is what you want. You have to keep telling your policymakers that this is what you want. It's something that we all have to be aware of, and we're lucky that after a lot of good work over the last few years, that people are now more aware of building electrification, but it's still not mainstream. It's still not widely spoken about, and it's not just the energy efficiency benefits, but it's health, it's equity, it's making buildings more comfortable. So there's a lot of other benefits that come with electrification that you need to talk about, other than just the climate change and the carbon emissions, which are really important to everyone on this call. But we're also trying to sell this work in Ohio, in Missouri, in places that are maybe a little bit more red. But there are still lots and lots of benefits for this sort of work. And so make sure that we're talking about not just the climate change benefits, but all of the other ancillary benefits that come with the work. I think it's really important to getting people excited about this sort of project. So I'll stop there and turn it over for questions now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Glenn. It was really, it's very, very interesting to hear, the practicalities of how to get these jobs done. I know as someone who's done it twice myself, that it's a full-time job to do. So,
but you replaced your own hot water heater, so you're like way up above and beyond what we expect most people to do. So
yeah. Oh, great. So yeah, so I'm going to just get it kicked off, the questions with a couple questions, one for each of you, and then Deepa's going to take over. So, and she's going to be scanning the chat and making sure that she gets to all of those questions. And so my first question actually is for Ari, and it's about friction. So like you talked a great story, you have a great thesis on, that basically if we just electrify every single new machine, then it gets us to where we want to be. So like every new machine that gets created in this world needs to be electric, and if we do that, then we have a much higher chance of defeating and winning the fight against the climate crisis. But there's a lot of like friction that goes against that happening, and whether it's like the industry with all of their invested assets to make gas burning furnaces or internal combustion engine cars, or whether it's the lack of, some of the things that that Glenn mentioned, like the lack of training and some policy maybe inadequacies. So I'm just wondering whether, when you look at all of those frictions, which ones do you think are the most concerning? And do you also see any areas where a jurisdiction is getting it right and doing the right things to make this happen?
Those are great questions. So I guess you mentioned internal combustion engine cars. I'm going to start there because I think if we were to have this conversation 10 years ago, 7 years ago, even 5 years ago, and we're talking about the timetable for EV adoption in the United States and around the world, I think we would have had probably some pretty different predictions than what the curve of uptake is right now. And there's like effectively a relationship between achieving a certain level of industrial scale and then these market solutions starting to become the self-evident and obvious ones. So we used to have in our presentation a slide that showed a picture of New York, Fifth Avenue in 1900. And it was, there were all horses and buggies and one car. And then a picture, I think it's actually Madison Avenue 10 years later, and it's all cars and one horse and buggy. And just sort of like to obviously convey the rate of change that can happen in decade-long chunks. And so what we really need the reason I'm starting there is because we are now at this inflection point with cars. Car makers are no longer going to produce internal combustion engine vehicles. Companies like GM that had spent $500 million on a brand new V8 engine program just canceled it after after selling about 5,000 units of that car because it was no longer economic for them to keep persisting with that program. So the sea change effect is here, and EVs will be the dominant solution in the market. So what happened with EVs? Well, a big part of what happened with EVs is that there was a lot of government engagement from folks like Glenn to make companies like Tesla actually live in the world, taking a risk on those technologies, commercializing those technologies, buying down the cost of those technologies so that consumers would buy them. And if like a Tesla could have been created to make a roadster for the one percenters, but until it got to a mass market and showed that there was going to be market adoption, the EV was not a solution that made sense for the rest of the industry to sort of take on. What has ended up happening, though, is because we've achieved a certain amount of industrial scale, the cost of producing these machines is coming down. And in 2024, 2025, the off the showroom floor price of an EV will be less than an internal combustion engine car. And the reason for that actually is that an electric car has about 60% fewer parts than an internal combustion engine car. It is, in the end, like a much simpler machine to build than an internal combustion engine car. So we need that same transition to happen across the stack. And that is really that sort of relationship of government investment in front end rebates to sort of like to lower the cost in order to make it so that these machines are the same price as the ones that they're replacing. But I'm in the middle of talking, beautiful girl. 1 second. And then also starting to knock down some of the barriers. And so let me just say like one other piece about the barriers. When I think about this, Glenn talked about like when your water heater goes out, when your furnace goes out. If you are in a situation where you're buying something in an emergency and you're told, I've got a great option for you. It's a heat pump. It's all electric. It's going to save you money. We're going to need to wait 3 weeks while we get that electrician out to get your panel upgraded, but it's going to be amazing. You're not going to agree to that in New York. No one's going to agree to that. But if when you purchased your EV, just to use this as an example, we installed outlets where your furnace and your water heater are and upgraded your panel at the same time because you had an EV charger. Well, now when that water heater goes out and someone says, hey, I have a heat pump for you, that is a much different proposition because it's really just about taking the thing that isn't working and putting in one that does work. And for you, the result is, oh, I electrified my home. That's great. But actually what the result is that you have a hot shower for your family. So I think those are the kinds of things where we need to focus on the policy market interventions that start to just, I think about it as sort of like reformatting homes so that they are ready to receive electrified equipment. And if that's where we can focus our time and our resources, then it enables Glenn and his colleagues at BlocPower to sort of do their thing. Because the upshot is Glenn is selling a better product than the fossil fuel person who is selling against him. His thing like saves people money, it is more efficient, it's more comfortable, it's all the things. But if you have a lot of brain damage to get Glenn's product, you're not going to call Glenn. You're going to call like Glenn's competitor who's selling something that's simpler. So anyway, those are the sort of like a little bit of context. And I think ultimately what that is where those are like the interventions that we need to be attacking, because it is if we focus on like banning things and that becomes like the like locus of all of our policy energy, then we're going to have a culture war on our hands. If we focus on just making it so that you can get better equipment in your house, then you're going to buy the equipment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the power of defaults is sort of, I mean, that's what's driving everything. People do the thing that's easiest for them, right? And that's across the board. It's consumers, it's distributors, it's technicians. They're going to do what they're unless something changes, they're going to keep doing what they're used to doing. And this is why, you know, at the DOE, that we talked about this thing called the BAS diffusion model, right? It's how technology gets out into the marketplace, and you know, every single slide has to start with this, right? It's the you know, the R&D, and then it's the early adopters, and then it's kind of like the mainstream adoption, and it looks like a curve kind of going up like this, and then it goes at the end, and we call them the laggards, right? Which is so it's kind of the mainstream adoption is when the defaults change, and the laggards is when you come through with like building codes and sticks instead of carrots, right? But we're on this upswing for building electrification, and typically in that upswing, the people that are doing it are well off. They're early adopters. They're you know top 5%. They're people that would probably be doing it anyway without a ton of additional government incentives. And what we want to do is we want to bypass kind of that upswing and go straight to mass adoption, but focus on people who are traditionally left behind during that upswing, because with early adoption, you accrue the benefits over time, and then you get to be more knowledgeable about it. And you know, if you have a heat pump in your house and you're a 15-year-old kid and you know how good it is, maybe you go out and you learn more about it. Maybe you start a company based on it. If you have the benefits of electrification, you know, in your home, you would talk more about it, how much more comfortable it is, you know, how the asthma rates in your neighborhood maybe are going down because of it. And so my thought is the way that government can actually step in, and Ari alluded to this, is any dime that the government spends on affordable housing, public housing, Section 8 vouchers, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars helping people have a place to live. Every dime that goes toward that should be incentivizing building electrification. That's a really powerful tool, because that's millions of units that can potentially be things that distributors and HVAC technicians have to have parts and labor and supplies for. And then all of a sudden, some of the defaults start changing. And so when you call Ferguson, who's a plumbing and HVAC distributor, you know, you no longer have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for a heat pump. It's just what they have, you know, at the distribution center down the street. When you call your HVAC technician, you know, they're not trying to sell you on the furnace replacement because it's what they have in the back of their truck. They have, you know, a couple mini splits and a heat pump compressor on the back of their truck, or a heat pump water heater on the back of their truck that's designed to serve a 1,500 square foot home. So again, it's the power of defaults. And then once it's a default, it's just going to win. It's just going to take over because it is better. It's a better product, as Ari said. And it's not too far away from being cheaper also. Right now it's a little bit of a premium, but that's just because labor tends to be more expensive because it's, people are getting comfortable with it, but there are fewer parts. It's cheaper stuff. If you've never been in a building with a mini split, I mean, it'll amaze you. You control the exact temperature in your room. The room next door could be a whole different temperature. You could do heating and cooling at the same time, depending on what the system is. So it's pretty cool stuff. But to me, for mass adoption, it needs to be just the default. People can choose to go out and get that dirty fossil fuel boiler if they want to, but it's harder for them to do that. They won't do it because they'll just do what's easy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, both of you. And I'm going to hand it over to Deepa for some questions from the Q&A. And I see that before I do that, though, I see that we only have like 4 minutes. And I just wanted to know if Glenn and Ari, if you have an extra maybe 10 minutes that we could tack on. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Deepa, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So we have lots of great questions. I'm going to start with this one. How is electrification green? How does it bring down emissions when much of the electricity generated still comes from fossil fuels?
Yeah, great question. It turns out, you may remember the slide I showed, which was all the American dream at half the energy, right? So it turns out that electric machines are just so much more efficient than fossil fuel burning machines, that even on the current grid, in every state in the United States, electrifying the end machines lowers the emissions profile of that state. And that's just on the current grid. Now, the trend line vis-a-vis the grid itself is toward a cleaner, greener grid. Coal, we're not going to be building more coal plants in the United States because they're diseconomic. They're not happening. So the other powerful part of electrifying all the things is that it also brings down, it sort of crushes demand for gas all in and lowers the price, making it further uneconomic to build future gas-fired plants. So ultimately, there's a relationship between these two things. On an emissions basis today, it's better. On a trend line basis, it's much better. These machines last for 15 to 25 years. So you're buying into that grid transformation over time. And you are also, as you electrify all those machines, helping to accelerate that grid transformation because the machines that are in the market have plugs and don't have pipes.
And then this isn't as applicable in New York City, just given the density of buildings, but in most places in the country, it's relatively inexpensive to add storage and solar to your home. I mean, solar prices have come down extremely, I don't want to say exponentially, but like logarithmically, like a lot in the last decade. And so if you start adding solar, you start taking assets off the grid. Again, it disincentivizes new plants. Energy and economies tend to grow, in parallel, or at least proportionally. And so it allows, potentially more energy use for other industrial assets that are harder to replace with electrification, although there's a future for that as well. And then it's nice because when you're generating solar for your heating and cooling, and your electricity bills, $30-40 a month, and that's mostly because they charge you to keep the interconnection. It's a pretty nice thing that you tell your neighbors about, and you spread the word, and then people start to think about it in a different way, and it's not just a green thing or a tree hugger thing. It's actually like, it saves you money. It's more comfortable. Again, it's not just appealing to certain parts of the country, but to all the country, which is really what we need for transformation.
Great, thank you. We also have a couple of questions from, let's see, Juan and Linda are asking about what has to happen to the grid to handle this huge transition. So how is the electrification system going to be powered with renewables in this transition?
That's a good question. It's actually, so at Ithaca, where we're trying to electrify 100% of the building stock in the next 5 years, that is actually something that NYSEG had raised concerns about. We think that the concerns are a little misguided. So what we did is I guess we kind of called them on it, right? So we're bringing National Renewable Energy Lab to help model the grid transformation. And so we will see at the feeder breaker level and at the individual neighborhood level, what the dynamic impact of electrification with different types of measures on the grid is for the city of Ithaca. Our hypothesis is that all it does is shift investment from one place to another, right? So utilities think about large scale generation, big gas and coal plants, some nuclear plants, and then big, long distribution, very high voltage distribution lines, large transformers. And these large transformers are actually national security risks, because if one of them goes down or multiple ones go down because of a terrorist attack, there is no replacement for most of them. You have to call Japan, and in a year you might get one. And so by doing more local distributed energy, again, with local solar, local storage, having electric appliances, energy efficient homes, you actually shift the cost from that large scale distribution and generation. And if utilities then start incentivizing people to do more of the work on their own property with the distribution, also with some demand response, like a control signal that can control when you kind of go up and down. It's just shifting resources around. It's kind of rethinking the role that a utility plays. But we think that there's a lot of evidence out there that to show that it's not going to really have that impact on the grid, in the sense that the grid can't handle these ups and downs and all these new things. It's more shifting where the investment needs to be made.
I would offer one additional point, which is that we actually are quite good at increasing grid capacity in this country. In a 10-year window, in the post-war era, we doubled our grid capability, and then we doubled it again in the subsequent 10 years. And so this is not an impossibility in terms of our ability to do this. And the benefit of having also distributed solutions, which weren't available in the 50s and 60s and 70s, actually sort of helps to radically do exactly that, which is distribute the generation load and help it and have it be such that the grid generation utility scale projects don't need to do all of the work.
Thank you for that. We also have a few questions about the cost. A lot of people are afraid of the burden being placed on the consumer, on the individual, rather than on the utility companies and other large entities that should be bearing the cost. So do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I think ultimately, from my perspective, this is electrification is the macro policy solution, and then as we ramp up that solution, we need to do so in a way that ensures it works at a micro level too, i.e., for every single household and family, and that entails, I think, a couple of principles. One of them is holding folks harmless so that we don't have a situation where people's bills go up. But it also involves kind of, frankly, coordinating that transition, because the answer is not to wait around to help low and moderate income folks electrify their homes. It's actually, in some respects, to start the other way around, which is to help them go first, and because they are the most likely beneficiaries of an electrified solution, but also because they, as the grid sort of transitions, they aren't the ones that are sort of being left to sort of account for the remainder sort of capacity on the grid, on the sort of natural gas infrastructure that's being retired. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be planful about. But you can do that through the design of incentives and programs, and frankly, also just through sort of the directing and allocating of resources.
Yeah, and there's really 2 or 3 knobs you can turn to reduce the cost of projects. One is just to reduce the cost of the actual equipment and labor. That will come over time as more projects are done. The other is, as Ari mentioned, to have government incentivize this work through rebates, subsidies, other programs. And then the third, which is one of the things that BlocPower does, is through creative financing mechanisms. And so what we do is we stretch the cost of this project over a 15-year period. We're actually potentially expanding that to be able to do it over a 20 to 25-year period, including a replacement cycle, without taking any security on the property. So we lease the equipment over this period. So we own it, which means we're responsible for O&M. We're responsible for making sure that it works correctly and protects the consumer. But the longer you can stretch that payment out over, the lower the monthly bill is. And in most cases, you're actually going to be saving money on the longer stretch. Right now, for projects in New York, if we're doing heating oil boiler replacements, those usually pay for themselves kind of on a month-to-month basis on a 15-year lease. Gas is a little bit harder, would require a longer lease period, potentially to match that savings. But again, we don't, this isn't all in the consumer. And so the things that policymakers and governments can do, or other business institutions, is by doing loan loss reserves or loan guarantees, ways to decrease that cost of capital, to take a 6 or 7% interest rate or higher down to a 2-3% interest rate. That can make a big difference on a 15, 20, 25-year lease period. And so that's another knob that governments and businesses can do, is by helping provide some guarantee to the people that are doing financing to bring down the interest rates as well.
Great. Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. So Sophie wants to know, what can you do as a renter in terms of energy efficiency in your home? Renting is huge in New York City, and we don't have much of a say in changing our energy systems.
That's a tough question. We work with a lot of co-ops and multifamily buildings. In a lot of cases, the buildings that we have found to be the most easily able to convert are ones that have had a lot of tenant complaints. So again, we work in a lot of low and moderate income buildings. And so in a lot of these cases, the building owners aren't necessarily, they're not, these rich building owners. They may be people in the neighborhood that inherited the building from their parents, or, bought it as an investment, and that's their only source of income. And in some cases, the reason they don't fix them up isn't because they don't want to, but because they can't. And so in those cases, we'll work with landlords to be able to finance projects, again, to help both them and their tenants with building electrification. But if you're just a tenant, the best thing you could do is help inform the building owner of the options that are out there, especially if you have older systems in your building. A lot of New York buildings, they have old hydronic systems with radiators, and it's super uncomfortable on the upper floors in the winter because it's really hot and you have to keep your windows open. And then on the lower floors, they're cold. So, these sorts of things, there's a whole other presentation we talking about organizing. This is Danelle's background, community organizing and community action. But there's a lot that can be done if you're able to organize a lot of people toward this change. But it is harder. There's no way around it.
Do you want to add to that, Ari?
Well, I just dropped in the chat a guide that we put out about electrifying everything in your home, which has recommendations for renters as well, and a checklist for renters in addition to homeowners. Certainly harder because you don't have as much control over these things as you do if you are a homeowner. But there are concrete things to do. One example of this is if folks are committed to not cooking with gas in their homes, which, by the way, is a smart solution for a number of reasons, not least of which are public health reasons and air quality reasons. For your kids, if you have them, you can purchase these induction cooktops that just lie right on top of your stovetop. They're great, and you can actually use them to cook as an example. So that's one small scale example, obviously, but it's a concrete one. And there are more sort of examples like that in the guide that I just shared in the chat.
Great. So it's now 7:10. So Paul, I'm going to hand it over to Paul.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deepa, for that. And I want to thank both you, Ari and Glenn, for for inspiring us tonight. I think it was great to see that there's a solution at hand, both in theory and in practice, and so we shouldn't be despairing. And we've also debunked a few myths along the way. It's in the Q&A that some that everyone has in their back of their mind, and that certain people in the industry are exploiting. I want to also give a big shout out to that guide. So I use that guide myself, that's in the chat, to do electrification projects. So it's a really good asset. I also want to highlight to everyone, if you could, we have the All Electric Buildings Act, which is something that would say that all new buildings in New York will have to be electric. That's already going to be the law, that already is the law for New York City, but it will be the law in New York State if it gets passed. So Anshul Gupta has put a link in the chat, and it would be great if you guys could click on that and take an action to help support that, because it needs to get passed both by the Assembly and the Senate before June 2nd. And with that, I just want to highlight that this meeting will be recorded. It will be on our website for anyone who wants it. And our next meeting is on May 24th and will be run by the Food Committee. So with that, I just want to thank both of you again, Ari and Glenn, and say good night to everyone.
Thank you all so much. Wonderful being with all of you. And thank you for all of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.